Hey, everybody, welcome to today's episode of the Growth Led Podcast. Today, I'm going to be talking all about retention strategies, ways to improve retention, and we're just going to do a full deep dive. I'm your host, Craig Zingerline, and I've had close to 20 years of experience working within startups and companies, and I have to say, have obsessed about retention. There's a lot of focus in the market about customer acquisition, and I love acquisition and I love experimentation and I love finding customers, but retention is one of the backbones of building a successful business. Hope you enjoy the show today. Okay, so today's show is all about retention, and I thought it'd be helpful for us to actually start with a definition on what retention is. So here's how I think about it. Retention is the measurement of how long your users stick around and are active and engaging with your business. And I would argue that this is one of the most important elements of your business, regardless of what your business model is. Even if you're a transactional business model, you may not think of retention the same way that a SaaS company would, but retention is still absolutely critical. So there's a few things to discuss around retention. There's what's commonly referred to as the retention rate. And so when you hear a question that says, hey, so what's the retention rate of your company? Or tell me about your retention as a company. You're often looking at a specific measure that is against a revenue metric. And so what you're going to do is you're going to think about what is the percentage of users that are still active after a certain period of time. And while this is great to look at, you have to have a retention model. It's how you're likely going to get financing. It's how you're going to do fundraising. It's how you're going to be able to think about hiring and everything else that goes in your business. We often overlook the more important aspect of retention, which is actually the product usage itself that leads to good retention or conversely bad retention. So by active users or activity within the product, what I mean is that what's the core metric that your users have to do to keep them from churning, to keep them sticking around? And so if you're a media business, this might be articles read or the level of engagement with your newsletter, or even how you're thinking about monetizing your podcast, if you've got one of those. If you're a SaaS business, it may be how frequently are people purchasing the thing that I'm using, or how much are they using the product that I have if I'm in a model where it's a recurring revenue model. And then for a transactional model, think of like your typical e-commerce company. It's how frequently is that user who purchased coming back and doing that same action over and over and over again. So for retention, we're likely going to look at an interval that's usually annual or monthly. But the thing with retention is it's really hard to think about from a very short-term perspective because it's a metric that's lagging in nature. And so I'll typically look at a company, I'll look at the lagging 1 year set of intervals at a monthly basis for retention and start there. So retention is really, really, really important. Well, why? So if you've got two companies that sell a product for, let's say, $20 each, and one company has a 90% retention rate and the other company has an 80% retention rate, the difference at the end of the year in terms of revenue, if everything else is held constant, is that the first company with the 90% retention rate is going to do roughly 25% more revenue than the second company that's got an 80% retention mark. And so while that 10% shift in monthly retention may not seem material, when you start to accumulate the impact of retention is where you'll really notice the impact. And so when we think about customer lifetime value, we have to think about it through the lens of retention. And so because SaaS businesses and even transactional businesses, when you look at LTV through the lens of retention, what you're going to basically do is look at each month. What was the starting cohort? How many people subscribed in month one, or how many people purchased in month one? Let's say it was 1,000. Well, what percentage of them came back in month two? And what percentage of those who were still around in month two came back in month three, and so on. And so from a financial model standpoint, your retention rate is going to be one of the most critical pieces that you're going to look at. So every time I build a growth model, I'm going to build a retention model alongside of it, regardless of what type of business this is and regardless of what type of industry you might be in. And so the impact of retention is really, really massive on your business. The other thing that comes to mind when we talk about retention is just the impact on the brand itself, on brand loyalty. And there's some really, really great examples. Netflix comes to mind when we think about great retention. These companies have to still work really, really, really hard to retain customers, but retention actually becomes a growth driver because they're known as great providers of value. There's a nice loop that gets created. Retention becomes a growth loop for customer acquisition. Okay, so let's dive a level deeper. We defined retention as an interval that you look at and that you have people that are likely paying you over some amount of time. Usually we'll look at this monthly or annually. One level deeper is the core action that the user takes to stay retained. And so let's use an example of a SaaS business. Subscribers continue to pay every single month for X number of months. Now, if you're a transactional business, retention to you may mean that a user purchases X number of times over that same period of time. And the things that you want to start to look at are, how do you impact retention positively? So how would you actually go about impacting retention in a way that will increase that lifetime value for a customer? And so we've used Netflix already here, but I'm going to talk about it in a little bit more detail. So Gibson Biddle, who was a former VP of product in Netflix, talked a lot about retention, and he does a lot of thought leadership on retention. And one of the stats that he mentioned was that in the early days of Netflix, roughly 10% of members churned or canceled subscription every single month. And by 2005, so well after years into the business, close to 5% churn each month. And today it's somewhere between 2 and 2.5%. And what that means is that those customers that are sticking around a lot longer provide a lot more cash for the company to do a lot more things. When it comes to content production, Netflix has been able to take that revenue that they're getting from users that are sticking around for a really, really long time. And obviously, in addition to fundraising and continuously raising capital, they're able to put all of that effort back into content production and really be the industry leader in terms of the amount of new content that they're putting out every year. So that's how I think about retention. And the thing with retention that also is really important is that even with good customer acquisition and activation skills, poor retention could still be a company killer. You really have to have a retention first point of view when you're thinking about building your business because of what we outlined early, those two different companies in those churn scenarios where one company's got 90% of people sticking around every month and the other has 80%, resulted in a 25% change year over year. But it gets more extreme as time goes on. So if you've got a company that's got 90% retention or 95% retention, what it means is that in year 2 and even into year 3, some of those customers that came in 2 or 3 years ago are still going to be sticking around, versus the company that's got a 75 or 80% monthly retention rate. Almost all of those early users, and remember, time keeps going. So as you acquire new users, more people fall off the bottom out of your model. You just lose in that scenario compared to the high retention rate. Now, it's really, really hard to think about ways to influence retention, but it absolutely can be done. And so I would say that having strong retention is one of those concepts where you really have to go back to the top. So you're going to have to think about, what type of value am I bringing to my customer base? And how am I equating value back to whatever amount of money that they're paying us? One of the challenges that I see with a lot of companies is that they don't really know how to think about retention. And so they go straight to customer acquisition and they start to burn a bunch of money in marketing and then realize that they've got a retention problem. Retention is one of those things that you have to adapt to early in the business. You have to think about it, you have to work hard at it, and you have to continuously improve that early retention so that you can then layer upon that with strong customer acquisition. And so the most common challenges that I see are when startups and companies go to market and they don't really have a clear understanding of a retention first model, and they put a bunch of stuff in front of customers and those customers sign up, and the company then has high churn. And what they do is they just build a bunch of new features, but they haven't really thought about yet how to proactively measure and even ask questions around how to influence and impact the retention in a positive manner. And so it's really, really important that you get this right. Now, the most important piece of retention and building a strong retention model is around what I call core and proxy retention metrics. So we talked a little bit about core metrics. These are the metrics that we're going to use that are things like monthly recurring users or number of subscribers or number of transactions per users. And so those directly influence the monetization of your product. However, it does take a while to understand what your retention model looks like. So if you're just getting started out, you have to look at something that enables you to gather some insights and make decisions based on data that doesn't take you a whole year. So what I like to think about are a concept called proxy metrics. And a proxy metric is basically the usage of the product, the core action that the user takes that leads to strong retention. And so when we think about the case of a company like Netflix or Disney Plus or Hulu or any of the online content companies, their retention metric, their core retention metric is going to be monthly active subscribers that are paying. But their proxy metric, the thing that they're going to actually measure retention against, is likely going to be number of hours consumed in a month by a user cohort. So Netflix has done some studies on this. It's something that I read, and I'm blanking on the source, but it said that 19 hours of content per month is what Netflix needs to consider a user active. And if you get somebody to spend 19 hours a month on content within the platform, they're likely not going to churn. With Velocity Growth, we do a lot of training. And so when we put training modules together, if our core metric is monthly active subscriber, our proxy metric is actually the number of times a learner or a student's going to engage with that content on a monthly basis. And so you will have a different proxy metric based on whatever type of business you have, but it's really, really critical that you figure out what that proxy metric is, because what it's going to enable you to do is actually put together strategies to positively influence those metrics. And so in the example of Netflix, if the amount of time spent watching content is the most important metric, well, they need to keep producing great content that I'm going to watch over and over again. And I'm going to get new content every month, and I'm going to come back because I know that Netflix is the place that I'm going to go to find amazing content. And if they fail at doing that, then it's likely I'm going to churn. The other thing that they can do is build user interfaces and marketing campaigns and everything else to pull the user back in, to nudge them to say, hey, we've got this great content, because if we can get you back in, we can get you watching. That's going to influence our positive proxy metric. So for your business, it's likely going to be something different, but your product strategy and even your marketing strategy should be determined, at least heavily, by those proxy metrics that you've come up with, so that you are able to guide your customers back into the value and showcase the value that you bring, which then leads to retention. So In terms of benchmarks and things like that, so if you're wondering, okay, well, how do I know what's good retention, what's bad retention? How do I compare to my peers? There are some good studies out there. If you are a subscriber to Lenny's newsletter or Lenny's podcast, or if you listen to or have seen Casey Winters do talks on this, they've put some really, really good benchmarks out there. And so this is taken from that. But retention varies wildly by industry, your business type, and in your pricing. But good to great retention when looked at over 6 months for consumer social is 25 to 45%. For consumer transactional, it's 30 to 50%. For consumer SaaS, 40 to 70%. For SMB and mid-market, 60 to 80%. And for enterprise SaaS, 70 to 90%. So that means that at the end of 6 months, if you're in that range, you either have good or great retention. So if you're an enterprise SaaS company and you've got 90% of your customers still around after 6 months, you're in that great category. Okay. So I get a lot of questions about, well, how do I improve retention? Or I hear things that people say around retention that you can't really impact it. And I think that's absolute garbage. You absolutely can have a huge impact on retention. And I would urge you to really start to think about how you can impact it. And I'm going to give you some specific examples. But first, I want to talk about cohorts and how to think about grouping users together. So we talked about core metrics. We've talked about proxy metrics and those actions that users take in the product. What I want you to think about next is on a monthly basis, being able to group your users, customers, buyers together in a monthly cohort. So a cohort is nothing more than just a group of users or customers put together as defined by something. And usually it's defined by sign up month or first month as a paying customer or first month as an active user. And what you're going to look at is the percentage of people who started in month 0 who are still around in month 1, 2, 3, all the way out to month 11 in this model, which would be after a year. And you can actually plot what's called an activation curve. You can take the number of users that signed up or that did your proxy metric in the first month. So that becomes your initial starting point cohort. And then track over time how many of them are still left at the end of X number of months. And that becomes your actual retention rate. And you can actually plot this on a curve. It looks really cool. And an indicator of product market fit is when the curve flattens within 6 or so months. So if you're signing up new users or getting new subscribers and some of them are falling off, and that's totally normal, you're still within that good to great range of retention, or maybe you're not there yet, and you basically see a chart that just shoots down right into the ground, where at the end of 6 months or 8 months or 9 months or even a year, you have no users left from that cohort that you're measuring, you probably don't have product market fit. So I would urge you to do some research on this. I've got a bunch of content, and I'll probably do an upcoming episode just on activation curves and cohorts. Stay tuned for that. But the way that we can think about retention from a improvement standpoint is from a few different angles. The most, I would say, easy thing you can do to improve retention is to actually focus on onboarding brand new users and then plotting their retention against your set of averages that you have. And so I use the analogy that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. That doesn't really apply here. You actually have an opportunity to find new users to come through the funnel, because it is going to be easier to try new things on that group of users that you may not want to do on your existing cohort. You can change behavior, so you can teach an old dog some new tricks, but it is definitely a lot harder to do than it is to pull together new groups of users who are going to experience your product for the first time. So the number one way to improve retention is to focus on getting new users in that you're doing different things to, whether it's showing them different pricing or different onboarding or different sequences or a different UX, or even a different value prop, and track them over time. And you'll get a relatively quick example in terms of how that new cohort performs and measures against your baseline or your existing measurement of retention. And there's been a bunch of examples of this out in the wild, but some ways that you can really kind of change how users think about your brand when they're coming in and how they use the product is by doing experimentation on the onboarding flow. And so you could personalize onboarding, you can be more aggressive or less aggressive. A lot more personalization likely will help. You can radically change your messaging. Basically, just force your users into a totally different flow that provides more value than whatever you've currently been doing, and then measure that and see if with these new users, if that retention's getting better. This definitely requires a bunch of work. So you're not going to just be able to, well, most of us aren't able to just simply reinvent our onboarding. So if you're really struggling with retention and you're starting to really get concerned about it, I would do a few things. I would test pricing, and I would look at how you're acquiring customers, but then I would get to work on building a new onboarding flow and new onboarding experience that you can A/B test against your baseline and see what you learn, because it's probably going to be the fastest change you can do. The next thing you can do around retention is target better users, or do a better job of finding customers that have high intent for your product. And so in some businesses, you are going to run channel experiments to find customers that may drive a lot of traffic, but may not drive high intent traffic. And you got to be really, really careful here that when you're thinking about marketing, that you're trying to map the channel and the customer intent to the user that you're going after, and make sure that there's a fit with your product. And there's really, what you need to do here is you just need to do a bunch of experimentation. I had one example where I was at a startup and our customer acquisition cost was in the thousands of dollars. And we ran dozens and dozens of experiments to bring the customer acquisition cost down. And we did a bunch of things around incentivizing first purchase. It really drove down our customer acquisition cost, but it crushed our retention in a bad way. And so you can have a scenario where you feel like you're crushing it on marketing, but you're actually driving very low intent customers that are not going to stick around. So I just wanted to give you a couple examples there. There's actually a lot more that we can get into here, but that should give you a good starting point. So I would say, again, focus on the onboarding and focus on the customer acquisition, and try to map to your model in a way that gives you great users that love your product that you can get some feedback on. Okay. So today we went through defining what retention is. We talked about core metrics. We talked about proxy retention metrics. We talked about activating your users. We talked about onboarding your users and running experiments against your current baseline, however you're currently doing things, to try to influence retention. This is not for the faint of heart. What I would urge you to do is get a spreadsheet and start to plot out your retention. Make sure you understand retention. Make sure you own it. I will provide in the show notes a set of tools that I use to both plot and measure retention for velocity growth and a lot of the stuff that we work on. So look for that in the show notes. And I would just urge you to really start to think about and understand in a very deep level what those proxy metrics are that are most influential to retention. So what are the things that your users have to do for them to be retained? And I would urge you to really spend time on that, because the faster you can own that, the faster you're going to build everything around your product to support that good retention. And then you can go back and bring a retention first model to the market. So that's it for today's show. I appreciate you tuning in today. Please let me know how retention's going for you. Let me know if you've got questions. I'm happy to dig in and help you. And I'd love to hear your feedback on the show. Thanks so much.